Okay, good evening. I'm Gerry Beegan. I'm the co-curator of the Angela Davis Seize the Time exhibition. I'm just going to share my screen and say a few words of introduction before we get going on the panel. A second, just pull my keynote up. Okay, so this is the third in our series of archival events hosted by the Zimmerli Museum. We've had two very thought-provoking, very enjoyable and very different events, and I'm excited to see how this one unfolds. So I'm Gerry Beegan. I'm a design historian. I'm a professor in the Department of Art and Design, Mason Gross School of the Arts at Rutgers. And along with my colleague, Donna Gustafson, the curator of American art and interim director of the Zimmerli, I co-curated the exhibition Angela Davis Seize the Time, which is at the Zimmerli through to June the 15th, 2020, before traveling to the Oakland Museum of California, where it will be on view from October the 8th, 2020 to June the 11th, 2022 to June the 11th, 2023. So please see the Zimmerli's website for more details of the exhibition and for future programming. So Seize the Time is centered on a rich archive of material, including magazines, posters, booklets, flyers, LPs, legal documents, and court sketches collected by the Oakland-based archivist and activist Lisbet Tellefsen. And this material is intertwined with works of art that speak to Angela Davis's historical impact and continued importance in radical intersectional thought and her activism around prison abolition. So this productive tension, this movement backwards and forwards between archive and art, between past and present, between memory and history, troubles our ideas of archives. So I organized this series of archival events. Sorry, I'm just stopping my share. To bring archivists, artists, and academics together to spend some time with issues of memory and history and their remnants and ephemera in relation to Black culture, using the exhibition as a starting point, but encompassing a wide net. We're hoping that these conversations will inspire individuals and groups to activate existing archives and also will spur memory work within local communities. And before I hand over to our moderator this evening, Dorothy Berry of the Houghton Library, Harvard University, who will introduce herself and the panel, I'd like to thank those who funded this series and the exhibition. This program is supported in part by the National Endowment of the Arts and by the Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts. Grant funding has been provided by the Middlesex County Board of County Commissioners through a grant award from the Middlesex County Cultural and Arts Trust Fund. This event is being recorded and will be shared on the Zimmerli's YouTube channel. Our moderator will be fielding questions, so please submit your questions using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Thank you to our panel. Thank you to my amazing collaborator, Donna Gustafson. Thank you to the Zimmerli's Curator of Education, Amanda Potter, for her work supporting the event tonight. And so over to Dorothy Berry.
Thank you so much, Gerry. So we're going to begin with some self-introductions, starting with me, followed by Elizabeth, Carter, and then ending with Jack before we get into our discussion. And in advance of this panel, I asked my colleagues, suggested that we pick archives or archival items that speak to us of the Black Sonic Archives theme of tonight's discussion. So I'm going to share what I selected, which is a photo of Angela Davis on the Mills College concert stage during the time before the Soledad Brothers trial. As you can see, there are many supporters of Angela Davis on this stage, and that is a stage that I performed on often when I was in music school, as I attended Mills College and studied composition and free improvisation with Roscoe Mitchell of the Art Ensemble of Chicago, while working in the music library, which would eventually lead me to being an archivist as I am today. But this photo resonates with me and with this exhibit and with these conversations, because conceptually these types of sonic events, be they musical performance, be they social organization, sort of become part of the physical spaces, although they are not preservable as material. And I think we're going to be discussing a lot about things that exist in the space, but then cannot necessarily be preserved in traditional ways of preservation. And this photo speaks to me of that, as I stood in the exact same space as Angela Davis, doing completely different things decades later. And so have tons and tons of people in the meantime, but we all are part of the same lengthy narrative of the space. So I'm going to pass it now to Elizabeth.
Great, thank you so much, Dorothy. Well, hello everyone. I am Elizabeth Surles. I'm joining you from the Institute of Jazz Studies at Rutgers, Newark, where my title is Archivist. And to introduce myself, I've selected 3 iterations of the same archival object. A recording of the song Richmond Stomp, which was recorded in my hometown of Richmond, Indiana, on March 20th, 1931, by a group of Black musicians from Chicago's South Side known as the State Street Ramblers. And there's not really an extant photo of the group, otherwise I would have shared that. Some of the players you can see photos of, but there's not an overall photo of everybody. So I picked this recording for several reasons. First, the studio where the music was recorded is the reason I'm a music archivist, and it was my entree to Black Sonic Archives. I learned about the recording company Jeanette when I took a jazz history class as an undergrad. I was shocked to learn that the small city in Indiana where I'm from played such a significant role in the history of popular music in the United States in the early 20th century, as many influential and pioneering musicians recorded in the company's studio. I sought out an internship my senior year at the Wayne County Historical Museum, where I cataloged Jeanette records. And ever since, I've been working with historic popular American music collections. When I graduated, I worked at the Star Jeanette Foundation located in Richmond. It's a small grassroots nonprofit dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of Jeanette. And I stayed there until I went to grad school at the University of Illinois. While I was at the foundation was the first time I went to the Institute of Jazz Studies, because we hold here at the Institute pretty much the largest collection of extant business records from the record company. So, you know, I've picking these objects also as a way to bring to our discussion some of the problems that we find with Black Sonic Archives in terms of getting at some of the music and the recordings and the sounds that are available to us today, representing the history that we're talking about. So, you know, it's all through the record company and through the business records. So I want to show you some of the material from the collection that we have from Jeanette. My object, I have it here on my desk. I have to put on my nitrile gloves as an archivist to protect the record from my fingerprints. And here you'll see is the metal master disc of Richmond Stomp. It's part of the Star Piano Company and Jeanette Records collection we have here. It came in this original sleeve where you can see, I don't know if everybody can see this at home, it says Richmond Stomp on it. And it actually says Chicago Stompers, which was another name of the group. The Institute also holds the 78 RPM issue of this disc, Richmond Stomp, State Street Ramblers. And I'd like to listen to a little bit of the music as well. So let me share the recording with you all. And here we go, Richmond Stomp, State Street Ramblers, recorded March 20th, 1931. And the personnel, before I play this, I should mention the personnel are a little unclear, but based on the discographical information available, Alfred Bell is on vocals and washboard. We think Jimmy Blythe is the pianist, although it's not clear. He died a couple months after the session. Ed Hudson is on banjo. And I think James Bat Robinson is also on this date. So let's take a listen. Just to give you a little taste of Richmond Stomp. So after I worked at the Star-Jeanette Foundation, I went to grad school at the University of Illinois. At Urbana-Champaign, I got my master's in musicology and library and information science and a certificate in special collections, and eventually found my way in 2014 to the Institute of Jazz Studies. So, you know, it was kind of great to come here and find the collection of Jeanette records. It made me feel very comfortable because I was familiar with the history, and I've come to really appreciate the wide range of materials that we have here, and also begun to think a lot more about the history that it represents, and also some of the issues with that. And I hope that we are able to discuss some of that today. So I will turn it over to our next presenter.
Good evening, everyone. Happy to be here. Just wanted to thank the Zimmerly for making this happen. You all for coming out. Dorothy for shepherding us through this, and my co-panelists for the knowledge that they are dropping. So I'm Carter Mathis, and I am an associate professor in the Department of English here at Rutgers. I specialize in African American and 20th century literature. I wrote a book several years ago called Imagine the Sound, Experimental African American Literature After Civil Rights. And that work focused on different kinds of exchanges, collaborations, correspondences between experimental Black writers and musicians during the 1960s and 1970s. And my object really for today comes out of that work. One of the chapters focuses on the Black Arts Movement writer, poet, short story writer, Henry Dumas. And Dumas was very close with the musician and philosopher Sun Ra. In fact, they were together probably the evening before Dumas was tragically shot by a New York City transit policeman in the subway outside of the Schomburg Center. one of the archives I visited to help write this book. But to the object, and first, let me just, sorry, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully. Okay. First, before I talk about the object, I just wanted to also show a couple of definitions. So first, just the archive, I was just struck with looking back at it. It's both, it's both the place and it's the thing. The actual object, but also the place where the object is. And just thinking about it as a verb as well, like to archive, what that means to archive. And maybe we'll talk more about how these definitions relate to our different objects in the bigger conversation. Also, I just wanted to say, in terms of the invisibility of archives, I was reminded in coming to this event about, Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, and I mean, the many quotes and perspectives on invisibility, but one being, I'm invisible simply because people refuse to see me. And I think with my object, that will be important as we get to it here. All right, so sorry about the blurriness on this album. This is Cosmic Tones for Mental Therapy, a Sun Ra and Myth Science Orchestra album that was composed or put together in the early 60s, but not released until 67. This is an album that Dumas wrote the liner notes for, which you can't see there in the back of the album, but I'll show you a clearer shot of in a second, right here. To just, looking at this paragraph here, to hear this music is to, to hear this music is to hear the solar band of revelation. The tones reverberating here pass through the time spectrum of the orchestra's mind, and you see with ear and with eye, and you become the metagenesis of cosmic atoms. And this alternation is also an alteration, which is the transmolecularization of man's future mind. Like the metamorphosis of the earth as it moves in its three directions at once in its third position from the sun, this music is the voice of the galactic father center, and like stages of the transmolecularization of the earth, it can be heard only under the driving power of the sun. So I'm just going to play a bit of conversation between Sun Ra and Henry Dumas in 1966. The conversation in the background, I'm going to pay you just a minute and a half. In the background, the music, the sounds you'll hear is the Myth Science Orchestra actually playing bits of the album Cosmic Tones for Mental Therapy. And the bit of the conversation, you'll just hear mainly Sun Ra speaking in response to one of Dumas's questions, and it kind of builds on what Dumas's liner notes were just conveying about this, the ephemerality of this music, the way that it is premised on a notion of, we want to call it invisibility, or not being clearly accessible, pointing to a somewhere else. Here we go.
You have to choose images and symbols, so it's too vast. Is that the reason why you are in the sun and sunrise? Well, everybody have to be what they really are. That's what I really am, somewhere else. I don't consider myself as nothing on this plane of existence because there isn't anything here. It just looks like it is, but it's not. It's just like you go to a theater and sit up and you look at a beautiful stage. It doesn't stay that way as soon as the next act comes in. Then you got some more scenery and it won't look like the same stage after the stage hands get to changing it around. Well, you can't look at the stage. Yes, the stage. What's the next act? Next act is the finale. Will music be a part of this finale? Well, music is going to be the bridge to. It's just a finale of the traditional things. The traditional things got some meaning in them, but comes a time when you need something else. Or you might say you go out, buy some food and cook it. You have to have some pepper and salt too. You have to have some seasoning. One thing I noticed when I was musicians that have come out of your group have always been various artists because they're giving you a little.
All right, I wanted to mainly end on that, the seasoning part that Sun Ra comes to, and I'll have more, more to say in the roundtable and the Q&A. But one of the points I just wanted to highlight in terms of a reason for bringing in this particular object is, I guess, the simultaneous difficulty in thinking about archiving objects such as the music of the free music of Sun Ra that is pushing against any kind of encapsulation, and then also the need to do something like, I guess, a different kind of archiving because of just thinking about the circulation of the music in this case that really ends up exceeding simply the music, because we have the musical object of the album, Cosmic Tones. We have the relationship between Dumas and Sun Ra. Dumas writing those liner notes, which are kind of expanding and building on the sounds in that album, and all of those points, the conversation, the liner notes, the music itself, create this kind of circulation or this orbit through which we can maybe begin to grasp the totality of the object, but it begins to be something bigger than simply the piece of music. So I'll end there, and we can talk more in the roundtable about these issues.
Am I on?
Your volume is on, but you're not screen sharing yet.
Okay. Okay, so my name is Jack McCarthy, and I would like to first say that it's a real honor to be here among this great panel and extend my thanks to everybody who helped to put this program together. I'll introduce myself very briefly and then talk about this project that's on your screen there. That is the main focus of my talk tonight. So I am a Philadelphia-based archivist and historian. I work primarily as an independent consultant on a number of different projects for a number of different organizations. Most of my work, not all of it, but most of it is on Philadelphia music. That's my area of specialty and my passion. But it's across many genres. I'm the consulting archivist for the Philadelphia Orchestra and for the Mann Center, which is Philadelphia's major outdoor music venue. And I've done a lot of projects on Philadelphia music, documentaries and exhibits and lectures and tours and whatnot. So my focus tonight is this project that I'm involved in, the Philadelphia Jazz Legacy Project. And I'm going to share a little bit about the project and then sort of consider how it relates to the theme of tonight's, or the title of tonight's program, the Archiving the Invisible Black Sonic Archives. So the Philadelphia Jazz Legacy Project began in 2018, so it's about 3.5 years old now. And the basic premise behind the project was that Philadelphia has this extraordinary jazz history. I mean, the transformative jazz musicians that came out of Philadelphia, it's really pretty astounding. You have Dizzy Gillespie, John Coltrane, McCoy Tyner, Lee Morgan, Benny Golson, the Heath brothers, Jimmy Smith, Archie Shepp. Carter mentioned Sun Ra. He's a Philly entity too, although he's actually kind of the opposite of everybody I mentioned. The ones I mentioned all sort of had their formative years in Philadelphia and then moved on mostly to New York or to other cities. Sun Ra came here later in his career and settled here. And I'm happy to say, the Sun Ra Orchestra is still going strong. I just saw them a couple of months ago. Marshall Allen, who was on that album that Carter showed, is still leading the band. He's like 90 some years old, and but they're still going strong, and they're still quite an experience when you when you see them in concert. But this amazing history in Philadelphia jazz notwithstanding, there was never sort of a broad-based kind of coordinated effort, community-wide effort to identify and preserve archival materials on Philadelphia jazz. A lot of different individuals and institutions have done great work, are doing great work over the years, but these efforts were not really archivally focused so much. So as a result, really important materials were being lost or in danger of being lost. So in 2018, my colleague, Suzanne Cloud, who's tuning in tonight, she and I got together and we arranged to get a grant from the Pew Foundation to bring together 5 Philadelphia area jazz organizations to work cooperatively and lay the groundwork to create a Philadelphia Jazz Archives. And a big part of our work was basically field work, going out into the community, into the homes of jazz musicians, or in many cases their descendants, because the musicians themselves were deceased, and seeing what's out there and seeing what needs to be preserved. So rather than sort of archival, or my archival objects that I'm going to present are basically a few images of the project in action. Here we are at the home of Charlie Rice, and that's his 2 daughters there with us in the upper left. And my colleague Suzanne is in the blue shirt at the bottom right there. So Charlie Rice was a longtime drummer in Philadelphia area. He played with Louis Jordan. That's a Louis Jordan photo, the band promo photo from the Charlie Rice collection. He played with Chet Baker. He played with all kinds of people. So here we are with his daughters going through his archival collection. He had been deceased for a brief time by the time we got to survey there. Here we are, and the other woman in the picture there in the middle is Barbara Benedette. She was a survey archivist that was on the project for about a year. But we're here with the widow of Jimmy McGriff, Margaret McGriff, the great jazz and blues organist, and sitting on the table there is a whole stack of packed stuff that we are about to go through. And I love the thing on the bottom right. In that stack of materials is this letter from Benny Golson, another Philly jazz guy, to Jimmy Smith, talking about an upcoming recording session, and Benny Golson wants to send Jimmy McGriff the arrangement for this song, The Crouch, that they're going to do. So that's what that letter and that score are about. Here's some materials from another jazz drummer, a longtime jazz drummer, Butch Ballard. He played with Duke Ellington. He's the drummer on Ellington's Satin Doll, the iconic recording of that. He played with Count Basie, many people. Up on the upper right there is a Christmas card to Butch and his wife from Duke Ellington. So this is the work of the project, going out into the field and finding these, pretty much previously hidden collections and surveying and assessing them with the intent of preserving them in a Philadelphia Jazz Archives, which I'll talk about in a second. And I wanted to add one more image, and not only is it musicians whose collections we are surveying, but collectors and photographers and jazz fans. This guy, Alonzo Jennings, is a local photographer who goes to virtually every jazz event in the greater Philadelphia area and takes numerous photographs, and he's been doing it since the 1970s. So he has tens of thousands of photographs documenting jazz in Philly over the last decades, and he wants there to find a proper home for them. So we're discussing with him the possibility of him donating them to this archives that we're creating. Now, the pandemic did interrupt our work a good bit, but not completely, and we are still going. And earlier this year, Temple University agreed to house the proposed Philadelphia Jazz Archives at the Charles L. Blockson Afro-American Collection, which is one of the nation's premier repositories of African-American history. So this jazz collection that we're surveying the materials for and assessing them, and everything's going to go to Blockson, where it will be preserved and made available for research. I think what's different about our project from some of the others on the panel tonight, it's now has an affiliation with a university, but it did not initiate there. It was not a university or an academic project. It was not a project of an established archival repository. It was a grassroots effort. It is a grassroots effort, just of jazz advocates and presenters and scholars who came together to sort of create this initiative. And I think that makes it kind of unique. So that's a little bit of what we're doing. We're still doing here in Philadelphia. So I was considering the title of tonight's program, Archiving the Invisible Black Sonic Archives, and we're definitely archiving the invisible. These are collections that would probably not have survived if we did not seek them out and, work to preserve them. And the other part of that is also, we know we're not going to get the papers of Dizzy Gillespie or John Coltrane or, people of that stature. But what we can get are the numerous musicians who, were part of the larger fabric of Philadelphia jazz, and, the lesser known figures or the maybe moderately known figures who, worked in the city for years and are an integral part of the scene. So we're hoping that all these collections, en masse collectively will help tell the story of this amazing jazz city. And is this a Black Sonic Archives? Sort of. Jazz, of course, is African-American in origin and, in tradition. And most of the collections we're surveying and collecting are African-Americans, but there are a number of white jazz musicians, and those are going to be part of the Jazz Archives too. And we are collecting a lot of sonic materials, recordings in various formats, in addition to photos and clippings and concert programs. So we're documenting the Black Sonic experience, both visually and orally. So in that sense, I think we are, archiving the invisible Black Sonic Archives. So I guess I stop my screen share. Yeah. So that's it.
Great. Thank you so much, everybody. And that actually is a fantastic lead-in to the opening question, which we have came up in quite a few of the self-introductions, but is not yet defined. There were some plays around with definitions conceptually, as well as with things being in or out group. But I want everyone, fantastic suggestion from Elizabeth early on, if everyone can define Black Sonic Archives from their own understanding.
Well, I guess I'll jump in. we're creating a Philadelphia Jazz Archives, which sort of by its nature is very much a Black Sonic Archives, but that's not what our intention was. Not to create a Black Sonic Archives. Our intention is to create a Philadelphia Jazz Archives, and by its nature, it's primarily a Black Sonic Archives. But I'm not sure, really what that term doesn't really have a specific meaning for me, other than that.
I guess to follow up on what Jack is saying, obviously I work at the Institute of Jazz Studies, so our focus here is music. And in preparing for today's panel, I've done a lot of thinking, and you can take the idea of Black Sonic Archives on so many different levels, from a very kind of practical, on the ground, archival practice kind of approach, to a much more kind of theoretical approach, to you can take it in a lot of different directions. And one of the things I've been thinking about at the Institute of Jazz Studies, in our connection to Black sound, is what is jazz? How do you even put boundaries around that? What's the purpose of putting boundaries around that? So when you talk about Black Sonic Archives, I feel like we need to think about all three words in that phrase, Black Sonic Archives. What are the ways that those terms work together? How do they mean different things to different people at different times and different places? And how does that complicate the levels at which we can talk about this? So, for me, I've always focused on music. So when I think of sonic, I think of music. And when I think of the invisible, the sound waves, you can't see them. And, they're produced, and then you hear them, or you feel them in your body. So it's a maybe more corporeal kind of experience for me when I think about Sonic Archives. And then I started thinking a little bit more, and we have a lot of oral history recordings here, and there's a lot of spoken word also on our shelves. And we have moving image collections that have soundtracks, and even in the recordings that we have, the music recordings and the archival music recordings and the oral history recordings, if you want to think about sonic, what about the sound of the space? What about the sound of somebody coughing? What about there's so many ways that you could get at this, that I don't feel comfortable making it saying that there is one definition, but I think there's value in talking about some of the approaches that you can think about Black Sonic Archives. And I've really appreciated the opportunity to kind of think about this in more detail through this panel, because it's not something I take time to do every day on the job. Because like today, I was making a finding aid for the Arturo Chico O'Farrell papers. Happy birthday, Chico O'Farrell. You're 100 today. And we finally finished your finding aid. So, I don't have as much time as I'd like to really grapple with some of this. But I guess for me too, like archives, Carter brought up a good point in terms of archives as place, archives as thing, archives as practice. There's lots of ways that you can use the word, and there's a lot of ways that it's used today commonly that don't really match with what my definition is as somebody who went to a school to learn how to be an archivist, and learned from other people who are in a profession where there's certain things that we do, and we do them in a certain way based on the profession that we're in. So I'm not saying there's a right way or a wrong way, but I'm saying that's kind of the perspective that I come from is, we have archival collections that are discrete groupings of things, or even a single thing. And it's all grouped on who it comes from, the creator of the collection or the item. And we try to preserve and provide access to those materials. Those are our fundamental goals as an archives, as an archival and special collections repository. So from my perspective, just on the ground running, what I do every day, that's kind of how I would answer that question in a very non-articulate way.
Yes, you guys have left me with very little to say. I mean, I appreciate both responses so far. I guess maybe I'd say for me, I mean, I see a few different definitions or versions of Black Sonic archives that maybe interact. I mean, as both uh, Elizabeth, well, really, I guess, yeah, as Elizabeth was saying, there's certainly like a distinct way, and this is certainly the case too with Jack, right? There's distinct archives, like collections of music and ephemera that can tell a story, that can capture, present the work of artists, keeping it together, allowing people to experience that work, to get a sense of what it is. I think then, as Elizabeth was suggesting, like within those actual archives that we think of as, you know, more traditionally, like these archival spaces with collection, you can then encounter like various kinds of sonic experiences, like you're saying, like the sound of a space, or, you know, voices in the background, or the things that you might not expect to hear that begin to tell a different story, and to open up like different interpretations or ways of understanding that music. So there's like a subterranean, I guess, archive happening at the same time. Then, you know, I was thinking about like Black archives and invisibility, kind of along the lines of the Ellison quote, like not, you know, being refused, having yourself refused to be seen, and that kind of invisibility of Blackness, and how that comes into play when we're thinking about sonic archives, and, you know, the importance of sound in relationship to sight when there is this invisibility, and the stories that sound can tell, in lieu of the visual, and how that, I mean, it's certainly something to consider within ideas of the Black sonic. But then I was also just thinking more broadly about, you know, archives of sound and their kind of history. I mean, we only have them going back to the early part of the 20th century. I was thinking about Buddy Bolden, and not ever, you know, they're not really being evidence of his sound, but so much sort of fame and acclaim built around him as a progenitor of this thing called jazz for many people. So there's, I guess, a way, and we could think about, like, you know, the book of Michael Ondaatje's about Bolden, Coming Through Slaughter, which tries to like step into that gap in the archive. And maybe that kind of move is, you know, prevalent within the idea of Black sound, like trying to think about the sound and how it can tell stories where the archive stops, or where traditional ways of telling stop, or just don't, you know, choose to go and access the experience. So I'll pause there, and we can, you know, pick it up as we go through different questions.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting in the responses that of the three words, the modifier Black has been the least explored in our conversation, but as a constructed term, Black Sonic Archive, it feels like that is the key marker. And I think that even the ways that we have been focusing in our discussions and our examples on jazz as the signifying music for a Black Sonic archive is part of a system that, you know, is already in place about what kinds of things will be preserved. And if jazz is Black classical music, then that's what shall be preserved in archives, even if it is the opposite of the constructions of a lot of things that would usually have been preserved in their analogous, predominantly white archives, which makes me think, Carter, you've written about and spoken before about improvisation in Black creative expression writ large. The freer that improv is, the harder it can be to be preserved beyond that single instance, which sometimes is the gift recordings give us specifically, as opposed to a lead sheet or a graphic score. So how would you, or anyone in the group, of course, formulate sustaining archives of ephemeral aesthetic practice? So not photos of events, which are now moving into the solid, but this sort of how do you think of archiving or passing on, which various ways of passing on, which are usually person to person, these sort of aesthetic practices that make up Black sound.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think one of the ways in terms of the music that I focused on in my book of that, we want to call it new Black music, creative Black music, free jazz, choose your categorization. But I found that in terms of accessing the ephemerality of improvisation outside of simply like listening to the recordings of those of free improvisation too, which is obviously a different thing. That often turning to and this is perhaps a little bit like the photograph, as you were saying, Dorothy, but maybe I think it's different. And that is the ways in which the musicians, the composers describe their practice in many instances. So we have both in liner notes of people like Cecil Taylor, Ornette Coleman, as well as like more extensive writing, essayistic writings by people like Anthony Braxton or Marion Brown, where they are, Marion Brown has an essay called Improvisation in the Oral AU Tradition. So in many cases, I think turning to the words of the musicians talking about their sounds is a way to kind of begin to access or grasp the ephemerality of something like free improvisation outside of, or in combination with the sound, like then like listening and reading and hearing like how they're talking about the practice. So I think it's at least an initial response to your question, but I think it's a very rich question and probably deserves continue like lifelong answers.
Carter, I want to jump in on what you were talking about in terms of the words of musicians talking about their sound, because that is absolutely the way to get at some of the meaning of the ephemeral performance and particularly the Black meaning of the performance, as for Black performers. One of the things that occurred to me, something that you find in archives that also contain the words of Black performers, are interviews and magazine articles and all the stuff that we have at the Institute of Jazz Studies, where people have written about the musicians and maybe they quote them, or they give a little bit of something that somebody said, but it's not complete, and it's filtered through a lot of other stuff, as compared to, for instance, the object that you shared, Carter, at the start, where I don't know about the record label that issued that particular LP and how the artistic choices were made. It's not explicit from looking at the album. Was there some other person involved in cutting the word count down, to what was on the back of the album? But my guess is that was, I don't know. Do you know the details of that?
Yeah, it's L Saturn, and so it's my understanding is that Sun Ra had some control. I might be wrong on this, but that if they didn't have direct control, had an influence in such aspects as like the, the album composition, the art, and so forth. So yeah, I think that there was probably, it is a reflection of some of Sun Ra's own intention on that.
Yeah, I think that's really important to note, because I think it's a very big contrast with the record that I shared, which came out on a label that was owned by the Jeanette family. And honestly, the credits say Melrose as the composer, and the Melrose brothers owned a music publishing company and music store in Chicago. And they put their name on everything because they got the money from the publishing rights when these records were issued. So, the performers probably got, and I don't know the details because the documentation is limited at best. So, most likely based on accounts that we know, the musicians got a flat fee. They didn't get any royalties, but Frank Melrose did because his name was in the publication credits. And so he was the one that was getting the money from the records. So, I think it's really important to look at how you're getting at it, because obviously the information you're getting from the archives is very different based on how the source was produced. And I was also thinking, as you were talking, just pivoting here a little bit, the environment where you encounter the archival materials matters in terms of how you experience it. Because if you come to the Institute and you listen to one of these records, it's going to be a really different experience than if you listen to, like, let's say your friend has a extensive collection of LPs or 78s or whatever, and you go to their house and that's their music archive. If they've arranged it and cataloged it, I would count that as an archive. And your experience in a personal space, learning from somebody else directly, is very different than coming to an institution where you're like, here, you have to wear the gloves and sign in and all the things that we do. So I don't know, Dorothy, if you have any thoughts about that, as somebody who also works in Jack, since you both work in kind of more traditional archival spaces, if you have any thoughts about that.
Jack, why don't you go ahead if you want?
Yeah, I'm on hitting the wrong button. Yeah, I've in my work, I've worked in traditional archival spaces, but also in these environments kind of that you were describing, Elizabeth, where we go into people's homes and musicians or their descendants, and review the materials with them and discuss the materials and get their perspective. But the other thing we do, my colleague Suzanne and I, if it is a living jazz musician, is we do an oral history with them. And we do this, and it's professional. It's a professional broadcast quality by a professional videographer. So it's really a high quality. And we put them on our YouTube channel of our project website. And so we can get, their direct reflections and memories and reminiscences and interpretations of their career, and that sort of complements the physical materials that that we're collecting as well. We don't always have that opportunity because the musicians aren't always alive, but we've done quite a number of those, and so that kind of is another aspect of the sonic experience. This is the artists themselves talking about their career and their work, and that, and so in that case we're actually creating new archival materials to complement the collected materials that they have.
Yeah, and I would say for me, thinking about, I think your point about space is really salient, Elizabeth. And I think for me, thinking about listening to music, I don't work in an archive that has listening at this moment, but I formerly worked at the Archives of African American Music and Culture at Indiana. And to me, thinking about that distinctly in comparison with someone who has like a huge record collection, I think when we're especially, it makes me loop back to this concept of the Black part of Black Sonic archives. Because in my experience, the large collections of jazz and gospel music and obscure Black recordings are often held in predominantly white home spaces, probably equal to predominantly white institutions. I'm thinking of even, I was recently talking with someone about Opal Nation's huge collection of rare gospel recordings. And I would call that maybe a commercial, like an archive of commercial recordings of African American music. I would not call that a Black archive. And even colleagues who are more connected, like I have a good friend, Mike McGonigal in Detroit, who does a lot of rare gospel reissues, and as recently has been doing a lot of conscious work to do those re-releases in community with the people that recorded them and try to make sure that some sorts of royalties and things like that get back to those people. But I think that, when these collections are divested of their relationship to Blackness as a community, as people, and I'm not a huge fan of what I just did, which is homogenizing Black experience into community or into experience. But when they're so separate, it then kind of raises this question of what is the context, because music doesn't exist in life, and especially not in Black life across culture groups as a standalone practice only. Music is very integrated, and that's true of them. Yeah, that's a very human trait, but it's particularly true to music for Black people in various contexts of oppression. And so the sort of idea of I was thinking when we're talking about recordings that feature different sounds and things, like the key nature of those Sea Island Singer recordings from the 30s and 40s, and the mixture of oral histories and storytelling and beautiful group singing. And those are recordings of very Black sounds, but their relation to Blackness writ large and to, the heirs' claims of Black people in Gullah Geechee land are quite separate. So these are things I try to be very careful about in working in predominantly white institutions with predominantly Black material, which is a lot of what I do. It's really wanting to be conscious of the frameworks and of the, not letting material stand in for humans and human experience.
Yeah, I was just gonna quickly pick up on that point to say that I think in terms of experience, I feel, that certainly in like the 60s and 70s, and I'd say like moving forward, one aspect that I've encountered, and I would say it's still definitely, it's probably grown now, is just the sense of collectives. So how musical collectives or conglomerations of musicians working together in a kind of organization or like a community formation, often it seems to lead to a kind of collaborative kind of archiving as that work is moving forward in this collective sense. And sometimes even, but I guess another word we haven't mentioned, but curation, where you have, now a very prominent organization in the area, Arts for Art, out of the Lower East Side, kind of a new music art organization that hosts festivals, and it's all dedicated to primarily like Black experimental music. And there's a kind of archiving that I think goes on through all of the events that the organization sponsors and curates, and creating a kind of archive of recordings of all of these live events that are comprised of contemporary as well as musicians going back to the 60s and 70s who are still around and performing. So I think, there's something about when you mentioned experience that I was just thinking about, like in the moment experience, like how communal experience helps form like living archives in the moment. I think that's important as well.
Carter, it's really ironic that you brought up the Vision Festival archives, because the Institute has those materials here on deposit. Well, I guess they're on deposit. There's not a formal written agreement, and we've actually been in discussion about the future of that collection because it's not accessible at the Institute currently. It's not described, it's not arranged, it's not digitally preserved. And the reason why is because it wasn't donated to the Institute, and Rutgers doesn't allocate resources to materials that may leave at any moment, because investing money in digital preservation and access is very expensive and resource intensive. If you follow, I mean, it can be, especially in a big organization like Rutgers, it's quite expensive. So, you know, we're in discussion with them, and I'm not sure the collection's going to stay here because I don't know that we offer the framework that suits the needs of that collective. So I think it's really, really interesting that you brought that up right now today, because we've literally been having these conversations with them about the future of the collection, because it's a really, really significant body of material that deserves to be heard and accessible and preserved. And so, you know, I'm going to do whatever I can to help with that. But I think to your point, it really, to me, highlights some of the issues we're talking about in terms of, you know, and what Dorothy was talking about too, in terms of, you know, it's not a Black archives per se, even if there are a lot of collections and materials that represent Black sonic experience and, you know, sound production. So I thank you for bringing that up. It's kind of ironic that you did.
Yeah, I actually wanted to jump in on that because one thing that we're not doing currently in the Philadelphia Jazz Legacy Project that I hope we do eventually is there's all these jazz organizations in Philadelphia that are actively presenting, you know, musical programs and concerts, and there, as I mentioned in my presentation, there are 5 jazz organizations that got together to cooperatively do this project. They all are presenting organizations in some form or fashion, and they're creating enormous amounts of, you know, content. Most of them do record all of their programs, and there isn't any systematic way yet to gather all that stuff. It's all, each individual organization is managing it or not, you know, or keeping it, but to sort of document that broad range of activity across a number of organizations throughout a city is a challenge, and it's one that I think we're kind of focusing now on, you know, this musician or that musician and their collection, but this sort of broader, active, more current scene is very dynamic, and it needs some major sort of coordinating to begin to preserve that as well.
You know, another thing that occurs to me, you know, you talked about curation, Carter, and Dorothy, you talked about the collection of, I forget the name of the person, the gospel collection that you mentioned. And, you know, there's a lot of intersections between and boundaries between collecting versus archiving versus curation. You know, they're all kind of intertwined, and there's shades of meaning there that I think are worth kind of sussing out a little bit. Because going back to what I said originally, you know, preservation and access are like the bedrock of my practice as an archivist. You know, this stuff is important. We're going to keep it. We're going to try to keep it intact so that people can continue to experience it, look at it, use it. And we're going to do whatever as best we can to provide access to it, so that it's not just in some dusty corner. Whereas like collecting, you know, there might be a preservation impulse there, but, you know, there's also it gets into some fetishization sometimes of objects and people, and but there's a lot of collectors in archives, and there's a lot of collectors who start archives, and, you know, kind of bring that history into the collections and into the institutions and into the repositories where those collections end up. And I see that all the time here. So I don't know if anybody wants to add.
Well, I was just going to say to that point that um, listening to you, I mean, it makes me feel even more, feel the importance of curation even more, because um, the archives themselves are can be very impressive and are certainly necessary in accumulating and gathering very crucial sounds in this case. I think that the curation, though, that the know-how of the verb archiving, like doing that work as archivists, it seems like the curation part can be extremely valuable, especially in thinking about Black Sonic archives and the need to like really the ways in which these sonic archives, these sounds, these examples of music are so tied into memory and history and struggle. If you have the curation of the collections, that is, because I was thinking about Arts for Art and Vision, you were just talking about that, Elizabeth, and the fact that, yeah, you guys have that material, but also it's like on YouTube, right? Like you can go and see a ton of like Vision Fest material on YouTube, and thinking about the difference in somebody just doing that, accessing stuff like online, which there's so much available, and what an archive could do with the curation is like kind of presenting it in a way, or drawing upon the creators of those sounds to help present it, to like craft the body of work so that people can understand like its whole. And that gets back, I guess, maybe to my example with like the Sun Ra and Henry Dumas, how there's so much entanglement often of different forms around like this thing that we often think of as a distinct sound object, as a distinct piece of music, which it is, which they are. But then when you really start to curate and think about everything going into it, you realize all these different connections. And I feel like archiving can, and the curation part of archiving can help bring out those subtleties to help people learn from the material, and not just experience it kind of in a moment solely and without like the context that might be helpful.
And I think another one of Elizabeth's points that's really key as well in that comparison of like a contemporary organization's records that are, in this case, on deposit, so stored at an institution versus stuff on YouTube, which is that it's on YouTube for now. And at any moment, something on YouTube is not on YouTube, either by the uploader's desire or by anyone else's, or by the corporation and whatever rights were signed away when you upload something to YouTube. And that is ostensibly a benefit of the preservation of other types of institutions with those other files, but then it's that conflict with access, all of it, because it's much easier to use YouTube, which you might be using in your everyday life, than to go to a university and get access to a recording one at a time in a little space, and can't wear your pajamas or drink a cup of tea while you're also listening to this music, which is maybe very long. And so there's all those sorts of things. And I also think the point about narrative building within collections and within looking at material, and how so much of that narrative with especially obscure Black music, again, comes to the listener often through the curatorial eye of a Harry Smith or a Greil Marcus. So it's still coming through this other vision. And I even think, I remember once a curator's husband was telling me that he was really into gospel music now, but he was listening to some very early stuff that was quite obscure and potentially I had not heard of it. And I said, oh, of course, because that's like the classic record thing of, this very obscure thing, but maybe you haven't heard of it. And he was like, this performer, Blind Mamie Forehand. And I was like, oh, you have American Primitive Gospel pre-war 1910 to 1920 from Revenant? Yeah, I know, like, that's where you heard that, because you don't have the 1927 shellac, because then you would be some other different type of guy. And I mean, that's like a funny example, because then I felt like a jerk because I didn't mean to say it that way. So I had to be like, oh yeah, it's a cool thing. But that's a lot of things of how, especially the way music is experienced now, in thinking of, getting into question time, and we have a question that will play into this, so I will start with this one. But getting into things like this question about discovering and collecting, preserving other types of Black music, specifically thinking of this context of the Angela Davis exhibit Black music of the 1970s. And it makes me think about, for me, a record that really got me going in my early 20s was a compilation that was actually the accompaniment to a book, Listen Whitey, the book about music and Black Power movements. And listening to Amiri Baraka, but things I hadn't heard, just sort of feels, which you then get to follow. And that's sort of the contemporary crate digging for a lot of young people with computers and not a lot of access, of getting some sort of mix or compilation or hearing that one thing, or even depending on their interests, hearing a sample in a track. And then that's how you get into jazz, because DJ Shadow was into jazz and now you're coming back around. And so there's this interesting mixture of that collecting ethos that is part of domain expertise and sort of community pride, and the collecting impulse that is perhaps an extension of the general imperialist mode of institutions. But thinking of the distinct question about collecting and preserving Black music of the 70s, I will say, to give a plug for my alma mater, that the Archives of African American Music and Culture is pretty encyclopedic attempting in their collecting of contemporary Black releases. And even Black, I would say, they're stretching African American to really maybe be African diaspora in the Americas pretty far. And I think depending on institutions, I think UCLA is also doing collecting this area, lots of places in Chicago. Maybe Elizabeth would know more because you're a real music archivist.
Well, I guess, but I was thinking also, one of the things that I came, as I was getting ready for this panel, Tulane's Hogan Jazz Archives has been around for a long time, and they've actually changed their approach recently, and they've expanded to not just jazz, it's New Orleans music, and they're really trying to embrace the full range of Black music making from New Orleans. I don't feel comfortable speaking at length about it because I don't know all the details, but there's a lot of conversation going on about how do we get away from that imperialist model that you're referring to, Dorothy. And Carter, curation is one way, but I would argue that even the act of accepting a collection, writing a description, anything at all, that's curation. I mean, archiving is never objective, even if the profession started out thinking it was. It's just been kind of slow to catch up in my experience. Maybe we're getting there, I don't know.
I was just going to say, Elizabeth, I've spent a lot of time in the Hogan actually recently for another project that I'm doing. And yeah, I mean, I would say the overwhelming amount of material in the collection is really reflective of more of like funk and R&B, really that kind of like 40s, 50s, 60s era of New Orleans music that, from long hair to everyone. I mean, that's, and a lot of interviews, a lot of stuff with Cosmo Matassa, who was the producer for so many of those musicians. It's a really interesting archive, how much material is there on different kinds of material.
Yeah, we visited that as part of our project. We went to different jazz archives around the country to, see how they operate. And you're both right. I mean, they have, Cajun and Zydeco music there. It's more a New Orleans music archives than a jazz archives, but I guess it must have started out traditionally as a jazz archives. And I'm just wondering whether the name is kind of grown to be inaccurate now. The other thing is that when we were there, they were kind of losing some of their separate departmental identity and kind of being absorbed into the library more, and not having a separate sort of Hogan Jazz Archives, but it was just getting sort of absorbed into general library operations. I don't know if you noticed that, Carter, but that they were very concerned about that when we were there a couple of years ago, that they were losing their identity as a distinct institution. You know.
I think from the institutional end, that's always that could be a pro or con. Usually that absorption also comes with maybe someone can actually process some of these collections now, but then you don't get that. This is very common for the small institute collecting at larger places, which can be good or sometimes really terrible. But actually there was another good transition to one of our questions, which I don't know if anyone will have the specific knowledge to answer or to address, but I will say it anyway, and I'll give my clunky connection. Carter mentioned the funk collection and how that is really strong at Hogan. And then this question asks about Ralph Ellison, who also came up earlier, and who hated funk. So, and hip hop too, but really we have quotes for the funk. But this question asks, since Ellison has been mentioned, can anyone comment on his essay, The Little Man at Chehaw Station, and how Americans can transcend boundaries through expression? And I'll say from my vantage, and maybe Carter, I don't know, I don't want to put you on the spot because that's very specific, but you are an English teacher, so maybe. But for me, I don't know that that's how I interpret that essay. And I think that some of the ideas about respectability and European music performance and musicality in certain types of codified ways is a really interesting stream of thought in Black production since Black people came on ships. And I think of that especially with this giant Burt Williams poster behind me, which is then connected to another guy who had the classic experience, Will Marion Cook, the Black composer who eventually was Duke Ellington mentor. But Cook famously was a violinist, classical violinist. He was raised by a family that had been free for many generations. Frederick Douglass helped raise money to send Will Marion Cook to Europe to learn violin with German masters. He comes back to America, he has his first recital, and then as the narrative goes, a reviewer in a paper wrote that he was the best colored violinist in the world. And Will Cook went to their office and trashed the place and said, I'm actually the best violinist in the world. And then never played a classical concert again. But even that sort of idea of the relationship to Western classical music and Blackness is complicated because then he began writing sort of ragtime-ish, but African-American musical theater songs and coon songs. And his mother famously said to him, and I'm going to censor this because of the group, but she said, I sent you to Europe and you came back writing that N-word music. Because that wasn't their culture. They were not part of this. They were not part of a ragtime type community. They were part of a very specific community that probably listened primarily to Western classical music. And so I think that, I'm not putting all of that on Ellison, who was both born later and has his own unique experience and identities. But I think that essay, that's an interesting perspective on it. And I wonder what others think that have familiarity with it.
Yeah, I won't say anything that specific about the essay itself, but just the idea about transcending racial boundaries, I'm assuming is what Suzanne is referring to through expression. I don't know. I mean, I think that they tend to remain, fairly fixed in different ways. I don't know that the expression is able to do that work adequately with the permanence of kind of white supremacy in this nation and others. I think like comments have been made tonight kind of talking about how at times, like archiving can certainly, it's providing a sense of this work, but it's also often, not in the cases of the archivists here, but it can preserve a kind of hierarchy of power that really doesn't allow for transcendence or transformation. I mean, that's, I think, the dangers of, as panelists have been talking about, of collecting this music in a certain way, like in and of itself, which is still, it's kind of codifying it and maintaining a kind of ownership of it. So I don't know. I mean, I'd hesitate to say that there's that possibility for transcendence and transformation through the expression. I do think that the moment in the 70s with the expansion into kind of freer types of music, there's certainly that intent among the practitioners to really have the music help people push into other kinds of ways of seeing or ways of knowing. But even that kind of I think was a whole other conversation, but there's ways in which, that sort of Black creative freedom impulse really got dominated by like white spectatorship and kind of, ends up being seen a certain way because of that dominant gaze. There's so much more to say about that. It's a great question, but I would just hesitate to put too much power onto the music itself to do that work of transcendence.
Yeah, and I think that there's really good individual examples in people's lived experiences of cross-community relations through music production. And I think that no one could deny that there's definitely been times where whatever the groupings would be, like, wow, this white guy sure is great at tabla, and now he's part of this certain. This is obviously a thing that happens in life, and I wouldn't ever say, for me personally, you got to stick with whatever music culture you were born in. Sorry, folks, even if you're really good at this other thing. But at the same time, I don't know that, I think I agree with Carter on this grounds of there are other things that will happen outside of that musical moment that will definitely be reminders that these boundaries were not transfigured in the moment of improvisation or something. And then we have, I think maybe Elizabeth, did you want to add something?
No, it's okay. We can move on to the next question.
Well, we have probably time for this one last question, which is, could the panelists talk about the difficulties of saving sonic archives that require technology that may become obsolete? How to capture the sound? How to capture the sound of an original recording when the original equipment is not easily available? So I will say I'll give a plug for a funding board that I've been on for 4 or 5 years now, long time for funding, which is the Council on Library and Information Resources Recordings at Risk funding stream, where because this is a particular issue, every year we fund about $500,000 worth of audio reformatting projects to increase access. And I'll say every round we've done, we've gotten more and more. We often have over $1 million worth of requests for that small amount because there's so much need for this, for access. And I'll also say this brings up something, and then I don't want to dig too deep in this, but I think about a lot with early recordings, because I tend to focus on early 20th century sound, is even the things that I have scant recordings for, it feels like that gives me maybe the example of what they sounded like recording, but I don't know that that's really giving me, even if it was a pristine recording from 1912 or 1915, I don't know that that's what they sounded like in situ. I don't necessarily feel like, for example, the Burt Williams Columbia recordings of Nobody. Is that what he sounded like when everybody really loved that song? I don't know. Probably less tinny in real life.
I've been, we have a teaching collection at the Institute when Rutgers students come and we give tours and demos, and I've been working with a class on the mechanization of music And we have a gramophone, an acoustic gramophone that works, and we play duplicate records on it for them. And the sonic experience is completely different than listening to any, and granted, I've been playing electrically recorded discs on an acoustic machine, so it's kind of mixing things up a little bit. But you know, when I think about like the preservation of recordings, and you know, invisible archival materials, a lot of people I think are surprised. Like they always think, oh, well, let's go back to the earliest, and those are the most at risk because they're the oldest, but that's not true. If you look at, from a practical standpoint, what materials are going to disappear if we don't do something, it's digital audio tape, it's instantaneous discs, it's magnetic audio tape. Shellac discs are going to be here forever. LPs aren't going anywhere, unless you like stick them in the sun or something. So I guess the other thing that I think about a lot is, and I struggle with this working at Rutgers, because I think that you can do things in different ways and come up with the same results. You know, if you've got a copy on YouTube, you've got a copy on your personal box drive, you've got a copy at your grandma's on a CD, like that's, you know, that's preserving it, multiple copies in different places, and you keep track of that, and then maybe you have your sister help you later. You know, to me, that's very valuable, and I don't know that all of the smart things that smart people have come up with to do. And Dorothy, maybe you can speak up. I mean, I know we're really running out of time, but as somebody who works a lot with digital collections, I don't know, do you have any thoughts about that side of things? I mean, we're kind of getting a little off topic here, but
I think maybe I can loop it to the topic and then we can have some maybe closing words. But for me, I think I know that digitization can be for preservation, but I tend to, because of both my ideas about longevity of collections and their importance over time, when we've got some really big questions about human longevity at the moment, I just think about access. So that's really primarily what I'm interested in. You know, I try to follow best practices, and luckily I'm at a huge institution where there are other people who will make sure that I am not breaking best practices for the sake of what I think is cool. But for me, it's really that access is the key thing, because I want someone to be able to have an experience with history in this moment that they're in. And I mean, theoretically, 100 years from now, someone will want to know what was on that DAT tape, and those are probably, they die every second. This is happening while we're speaking. But, you know, I think that also that is sort of, some preservationist feels to me like an added bonus. You know, if the thing got its original purpose, which was maybe to be an event that happened in real life, and then the secondary purpose was to make a recording of it for future, and then some people got to listen to it, but now 30 years later, some people can't. That's a few generations of useful purpose. And that's maybe not the most best archivist thing to say, but it's, you know, nothing lasts forever. But we are almost at time, so actually now we are at time. So I think maybe we can hand it back to anyone else who wants to say anything, and then I think we can close out. So I'll just end my part and say that I'm really grateful for this rich conversation, for everybody being so open and thoughtful, and for the fantastic questions that we got. And also, especially thanks to Amanda for putting links in the chat all the time for all the things we were bringing up without linking to ourselves.
I would just like to say overall, I'm just sort of heartened and gratified that all over the world and all over the country, people are actively collecting and preserving, and they realize the value of this music, Black music in particular, all music. There's so many do-it-yourselfers that are collecting things and taping things, and you see them at performances, videotaping or taping on their phones. And there's just a real, I feel like throughout the world, this realization of the importance of capturing this material. And it's up to us as archivists to sort of, okay, how do we gather and preserve and make this stuff available? But I just think the interest is there, and that's the important thing, to me.
Yeah, thanks to everyone. This is a super informative and, energizing conversation. And I really liked a lot of the last points that are, making me also feel like, kind of with the optimism that Jack's expressing, we might be at a moment now where there's there's this energy to archive and curate in ways that will kind of push it into new territory, and that can kind of incorporate a lot of the collaborative work that's been going on for decades in many of Black musical communities, so that moving forward we might, our sense of what the Black Sonic Archive is, maybe something a bit unrecognizable compared to where it has been, where we are right now. I think we're moving in a really positive, fruitful direction, though.
Thanks to everybody for coming and for such a great conversation. I have this whole presentation and my preparation for it has given me a lot to think about and a lot of ideas about things that we can do closer to home, in connection with some of the things that we've talked about. So, and everybody who's here should go, if you're in New Jersey, go to New Brunswick and see the exhibit. The archival collection that's on display is fantastic. The exhibit is great, and you won't regret it.
Okay, I'll just pop on to say thank you so much, everyone, tonight for a wonderful program. Thank you, Gerry, for organizing a fantastic series, and to Donna and Gerry, again, congratulations on a wonderful exhibition and the rich conversations that it's triggered. And there's lots more in store, so definitely stay tuned. Check out the Zimmerle's website and our YouTube channel. And again, thank you again, everyone, and have a great evening.
Thanks.